Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation about reclaiming the faith and moral narrative as the Biden administration prepares to take office. I'm John Gehring. I'm the Catholic Program Director at Faith and Public Life Action Fund, and it's great to have you all with us today. I know it's sort of pro forma for the moderator, myself, to gush about how wonderful their panelists are, but in this case, it is really true. When I had the idea for this conversation, I sort of had, a dream team in my head of who we could put together. And I thought, all right, maybe we'll get one or two, maybe three. But it turns out that we have all five of my dream team assembled here today. So the starting lineup is strong. And I will introduce everyone briefly, and then we're going to just jump into this conversation because we have a lot of ground to cover. First, I'd like to introduce Melissa Rogers. Melissa is a visiting professor at Wake Forest University Divinity School and a non-resident senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. From 2013 to 2017, she served as President Barack Obama's executive director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnership, and she is the author of Faith in American Public Life, and also co-author of Religious Freedom and the Supreme Court. So welcome, Melissa. It's good to see you as always. Next, we have Lisa Sharon Harper. Lisa is a writer and activist and the founder and president of Freedom Road, which is a group that trains religious leaders on participating in social action. I love Lisa because she seems to show up whenever there's trouble or justice to be had. So she was in Ferguson, Missouri, working with evangelicals to speak out against police violence. She was in Charlottesville, Virginia, to mobilize the faith community in reaction to the violent white supremacist rally there. She's the author. We have a lot of authors today. She is the author of several books, including Evangelical Does Not Equal Republican or Democrat, and The Very Good Gospel, How Everything Wrong Can Be Made Right. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Jamar Tisby is also with us. He is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. And Jamar's writings have been featured in the CNN, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New York Times. Jamar is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Mississippi and the founder and CEO of The Witness. His forthcoming book is called How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. Welcome, Jamar. We also have Sister Simone Campbell, who many of you know very well from Nuns on the Bus. She's also the executive director of Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. And I believe, is it 7 cross-country Nuns on the Bus tour at this point, Simone? So Simone has seen this country. The bus tours have focused on issues of tax justice, healthcare, immigration reform, voter turnout, mending the gaps in income and wealth inequality. Simone is the author of A Nun on the Bus, How All of Us Can Create Hope, Change, and Community. And I believe you have a new book coming out too. Is that right, Simone? That would be,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's out in December, or it was out in September, and it's called Hunger for Hope.
Great. And last but not least, I'm really honored to be joined by Maggie Siddiqui, who's the director of the Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative at the Center for American Progress. Maggie previously served as Director of Communications and Strategic Initiatives for the El Hibri Foundation, an organization advancing inclusion of and within the American Muslim community. So welcome, Maggie. And I want to note for our viewers and also our panelists that Maggie is going to have to leave after about 25, 30 minutes. She's a very busy schedule today, but we're really honored that she took the time to squeeze us in her schedule. So I just wanted people to know that, because if she disappears, it's not because she was frustrated by the conversation, but moving on to another meeting. So I want to start sort of with a big picture question I'm hoping all of you can kind of take a crack at, and then we'll sort of zoom into a few more specific questions. But, I've been thinking a lot, as I'm sure all of you have, about just sort of how traumatic the last 4 years have been. Those of us who care about religion and public life, religion and politics, the past 4 years under the Trump administration is really, I think trauma is the right word. And we know this well. Religion over the last 4 years has been used in some sense as sort of this carnivalesque prop, but on the other hand, a very dangerous weapon, really in the service of a white Christian nationalist agenda. And we all know the sort of headlines well, right? Sort of Trump's photo op in front of St. John's after tear gassing peaceful protesters, the Muslim ban, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions quoting the Bible to justify the Trump administration's cruel immigration policy. So my first question, and I'd like to start with Maggie on this one, is how do we begin, first off, to heal from this gross distortion and misuse of religion from the highest office? And then what is sort of the biggest opportunity you see to kind of really reclaim the faith narrative in the Biden-Harris administration? So Maggie, if you want to start us off, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks so much for that question. And thanks for having me on this panel and understanding. I'm sorry I have to leave early. So excited to be able to join you for this first part. Yeah, I think the Biden-Harris administration has a tremendous opportunity in this current moment to reclaim a new narrative. And part of that is just returning the government toward having a positive and unifying approach toward religious communities. I mean, you used the phrase, I think it was extreme misuse of religion with regard to the Trump administration. And that's exactly right in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. For example, the Trump administration had an opportunity to engage people of faith, had the opportunity to ask us to come together to protect our public health, including by worshiping online or in socially distanced ways. And instead, it encouraged faith communities to flout public health guidance and suggested that doing so was necessary to protect their religious freedom. Fortunately, we know most faith communities did not listen, and because a critical part of our traditions is to save lives, most did the right thing, but it certainly led to a lot of polarization, confusion within our communities, tension between our communities and our local governments, all kinds of chaos. And so really, the Biden-Harris transition team, by contrast, it's almost like a low bar that they have to really shift gears here. They're already taking steps toward working with our communities to help us come together over this collective crisis that we're facing that has impacted us all in so many ways. So first of all, we have yet to mourn the over 300,000 deaths in this country from COVID-19. Our faith communities have been on the front lines of helping people mourn who have lost loved ones. We have been there to witness funeral after funeral, and it will go a long way to have a president who will work with us and help us come together as one to mourn the loved ones that we have lost, the family and friends we will never see again in this life. And I think there's a critical opportunity for this administration to return to engaging religious communities to do that kind of work and for the purpose of serving the common good, rather than using religion as some kind of political prop. Our communities are all about serving others, caring for one another. And so I think enlisting our help in these efforts to stop the spread of the virus, to take the vaccine and so on will be really, really powerful as one of the first steps you might take.
Yeah. Thank you, Maggie. Simone, did you want to?
Sure. Oh, Maggie, I so agree that it's about the living, breathing reality of our faith. It's not the photo op or the transactional moment. And I think that is one of the things that has been so difficult over these last 4 years, is the fact that faith got unhooked from behavior and got only used as this thing to be held up and done in a tweet. And the horror is that so many people thought that was authentic. And I think one of the challenges faced by Biden-Harris, and I totally agree, they're already engaged in this work, but one of the challenges is helping our people come together again in that authentic way of that it comes from the inside out. It's not a jacket you put on and get your picture taken and then take off, but rather our faith has consequences. And I think some of your work, Jamar, how the churches need to engage in the work of deconstructing structural racism, and how we need to engage in conversation with each other because we're community, not because we're enemies. And it's that communal thing that I think President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris do really well. They call us together. And I have a lot of hope that that's going to be a way forward that's authentic.
Thank you, Simone. I really appreciate the comment too about moving from sort of this transactional use of religion to a more authentic understanding of the faith community. I appreciate that. Lisa? I think you're on mute, Lisa.
So sorry about that. Okay. So I think that the thing that that strikes me when I think about this is that I think we heal by reconnecting with the sacred inside of us and the sacred inside of the other. One of the biggest ways that the Trump administration, the last 4 years, and quite honestly, a string that has gone through our American history from the very, very beginning, has been the lack of recognition and, in fact, the domination of the image of God in the other and the erasure of it. And I think that in particular, the trauma of the last 4 years has been the pervasive nature of that erasure of the sacredness of us as human beings. That has been, it's been not only limited even just to one people group or two people groups, it's literally hit everybody. And I think it's most, you can see it most clearly through the COVID policy. The fact that hands were just thrown up, we care more about the image of our presidents on the dollar than we care about the image of God in those who are living in our communities, those who are our legislators are tasked to govern and care for and protect. So I think the Biden administration can reclaim its moral narrative by expanding democracy, by recognizing the reality that what it means to be human is to be made in the image of God, is to be sacred. And what it means to be sacred is actually to be called and created with the capacity to exercise stewardship of the world, agency. And that's part of what we just felt so stripped of over the last 4 years. I mean, we were stripped of our agency because our democracy itself was put at threat. The rule of law was dismantled. So the building back of the rule of law, the expansion of democracy, the protection and actually the bolstering of the Voting Rights Act, all of these things and more, things that recognize, protect, and cultivate the capacity of all of us to make decisions that impact our nation. Those are the kinds of things that will help us to heal.
Thank you, Lisa. And I appreciate that very powerful image you put before us of the image of God, the Imago Dei, and the image on the money, and what we tend to hold sacred and the contrast in that. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Jamar, love to hear your thoughts on this.
So as we think about how we can begin to heal from this extreme misuse of religion, there are lots of ways, but I'm always going to recommend a deeper study of history. If we think about this awful pandemic, what is the first step that we have to take if you get COVID? What's the first step you have to take to get treatment? You actually have to have the diagnosis. You got to get tested first, and you got to figure out what's wrong. And to me, studying history serves a similar function. We can't begin to prescribe solutions. We can't begin to talk about healing unless we understand the malady. And unfortunately, in the United States, we just have a really awful memory. It gets deliberately distorted by certain actors and people in power, but also just not having good skills or placing the importance on history that we need to, aside from a very few, broadly known events that even themselves, for instance, the civil rights movement, are oftentimes misunderstood. And so I think as we study history, we can see this really unhelpful intertwining of religion and nationalism, and it can help us understand how we got to this moment. And from there, we can prescribe better solutions to the problems of the present. So part of healing from this misuse of religion is understanding the path to where we got, how we got to where we are. And then with the Biden-Harris administration, I think they have a real opportunity in a lot of ways. First of all, I don't know the details of their personal faith journey, but they seem to have a faith that's at least not entirely utilitarian or political in nature. I hope they don't use the power of their office to brutalize protesters on their way to a photo op holding a Bible in front of the church. But even further than that, I think they have an opportunity, neither of them being white evangelicals, which has taken on such a political and cultural baggage, right? Biden being Catholic, Harris coming from a Black church tradition. I think they have the opportunity to expand notions of what Christianity looks like and can be like that's different from what we've seen the last 4 years. And I think they can allow the nation to see different Christian expressions so that we are not boxed into thinking that all Christianity is what we've seen expressed in this current administration.
Yeah, thank you for Jamar. I appreciate your point about the historical perspective too. Before this conversation, I was listening to a local Kojo Nambi, who's a WAMU radio host, interviewing Reverend Bill Lamar. And as some of you may have followed in the national news, the Black Lives Matter sign in front of his church was ripped down during the Proud Boys, riot, or however we want to call it, their awful behavior, violent behavior. And he was making the point you're making, which is sadly, there's, particularly in the African-American community, there's nothing new about this, but this is part of a long trauma that Black Americans have faced for centuries. And so I really appreciate your point, and also the point about how history can be distorted in terms of the lens in which we view it or how we view it. So really appreciate that. Melissa.
Yes, well, I appreciate what the co-panelists have said so much, every point. I also want to say that I think a good place to start for all of us is to remember the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King when he said the church is not to be the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. And of course, that's true about all religious traditions. And it's a very helpful principle for us all, whether we're in public life or non-governmental life, to follow, to think about how we can not break this pattern of being cheering squads for a particular politician and his or her personal interest, and being used in that way, as opposed to bringing integrity to relationships with government officials in the public square, where there is common ground sometimes and there is not other times, and where there is not common ground, then there's a necessary role for religious and other groups of conscience to say that, we think someone's taking the wrong path and they need to be held accountable, no matter their party and no matter, how close we may feel to them personally. So that's a sometimes challenging role, but I think that's the right kind of guidance that we all need to embrace. And I think the Biden-Harris administration can be part of reclaiming that tradition. Also, I think there is just a real need to do two things, and the comments so far have indicated it. We need to correct injustices and errors while also building bridges and healing divides, both things at once. So whether it's ending the Muslim ban on day one or rebuilding our refugee admissions and resettlement process, those are errors, just some of them, errors that need to be corrected and promptly. At the same time, I think we need to stop this culture of owning one another, especially in religious communities, and relating to one another as people of equal dignity and infinite worth. So what can we do to bring people of goodwill back around the table, and do so in really tangible, visible ways place, because I think we're all hungry for that, to see that tapestry of, the great diversity of Americans represented at the White House and in many other settings, where we're coming together across our differences and backgrounds and beliefs and talking thoughtfully and working together where we can, and where we can't, listening to one another and trying to be respectful even as we differ. So I hope that we see some of that very early on. Maggie was mentioning about the pandemic in her remarks. I think turning, as the Biden-Harris team already has, to an ethic of love of neighbor, which can be embraced from a religious or non-religious perspective, and drawing together all the religious and civil society leaders who want us all to wear masks and to take care of one another, especially the vulnerable, and to mourn those who we lost. Seeing that very tangibly represented, I think, is going to help us all to exhale a bit and to begin to be more hopeful about our common civic life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Melissa. I wanted to kind of now transition to some more specific questions for each of you in terms of your expertise and background. And Maggie, I wanted to start with you. The initiative you lead at the Center for American Progress, the Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative, recently came out with a set of recommendations for the Biden administration on engaging with religious communities. And one of those recommendations is that President Biden should deliver a speech on religious freedom and religious pluralism early in his term. And I want to ask you why you see that as something that would be significant, and if you were advising the president on that speech, what would you want to see?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So we think that this is so critical for him to do because, first of all, we have a number of challenges to our religious freedom here in our country and around the world. By way of example, as Melissa just reminded us, we still have a Muslim ban in our country, a religious test imposed on our nation's immigration system in clear violation of our principle of religious freedom. Thankfully, President-elect Biden has promised to repeal that ban as one of his very first acts in office. Throughout the Trump administration, we also saw a number of attacks on the very definition of religious freedom, essentially creating a legal defense for far-right social conservatives to misuse the principle of religious freedom to violate non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, women, and even for minority religious groups and non-religious groups, the people who rely most intimately on the right to religious freedom. So it's really been a very powerful distortion, and it's important that President Biden make clear that this distortion of our First Amendment right will not continue under his administration. I think, as others have alluded to as well, just on why we would ask him to speak about religious pluralism as part of that, is it really needs to be in this grounded in this vision of religious pluralism and who makes up America. Too often in our discourse on faith in politics, we see some groups like white evangelicals, as Jamar noted, receive really outsized attention. And we think it's important that we recognize the racial and religious diversity within our communities. Most Americans across the political spectrum identify with a religious tradition. And it is important that our nation's highest office recognize the diversity of our religious communities and include non-religious groups among that as well. So I'd love to see him speak about that and give assurances to the American public that he will represent all of us, including with regard to his vision of religious freedom and religious pluralism.
Thank you, Maggie. Lisa, I wanted to ask you, so you were part of Evangelicals for Biden. You first endorsed Elizabeth Warren during the primary election, as did a number of prominent Black Christian women, such as Tracy Blackman. And I went back and read something that you wrote in Sojourners magazine. I think this was about 6 months before the election. And you said Warren had listened deeply to the African-American community and many other marginalized communities, and the result was a deeply intersectional platform. And then you added that, quote, perhaps in normal times, Black voters would risk a Warren vote, but that we are wounded and Black people are terrorized. In the middle of terror, dreaming becomes nearly impossible. A person has one goal: make it stop. And I wanted to sort of bring that up as context, just because I think it's, my question, I guess, for you is, How does Joe Biden and his team both start the process of deep healing that you talk about that needs to happen, these deep wounds in the Black community and people of color more broadly outside of the Black community? You write about that very powerfully, but at the same time, how does his team create a policy agenda that seeks to address inequality and structural racism in the kind of intersectional way that you note in that article that got you and others so animated around Warren's candidacy?
Thank you so much for asking that. I was actually really amazed by the response to first the Twitter thread where that came from, and then the transition into the Sojourner's article. I think that when we look at the level of terror that has been levied on the backs of people of African descent in the United States over the last 4 years, you really can't understand the depth of it unless you understand the reality that it doesn't just stand on its own. It's actually layered on top of centuries of terror that have never really gone addressed. I mean, you have to look at it, first of all, through historic and intersectional oppressions that 400 years, you just have to say just that. That's really enough. 400 years, 400 years. Legal, economic, environmental, and social structural oppression that was erected to protect the supremacy of whiteness in this land through the exploitation, rape, and neglect of people of African descent. And then you add on top of that the whiplash that has come at us 3 separate times after 3 separate reconstructions. First was the Reconstruction after the Civil War. We flourished. Black soldiers helped turn the tide of the Civil War. Our nation passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. We rose into government in every level, local, state, and national. But our Congress did a backroom deal that sold us downriver, sold us out with the 1877 Compromise. And that's what then started another 100 years of terror under Jim Crow. And then we pushed back with Brown versus the Board of Education and Montgomery and the Freedom Rides and Birmingham and Mississippi and Selma. And we won the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. We began to push against Black poverty. Within 10 years, we saw Black poverty drop by 10%. That is unheard of. That's incredible. But then Nixon sold us out by erecting a policy of dog whistles and trying to attract Southern Democrats. So compromise has never been a good word for people of African descent. But then we pushed back again with Obama. And with Obama, we had the institution of health, not universal health care, forgive me, but more health care. 30,000 more people got health care than 30 million, rather, got health care than had. And we had a crackdown on predatory lending. And we had our brother's keeper and the 21st century task force on policing. But we also, at that same time, had the Tea Party pushback and the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act and state legislatures passing stand your ground laws that effectively hobbled civil rights for people of African descent and other people of color. And then a neo-Nazi president is elected into office, and he takes a wrecking ball to it all. So that was the place that we were standing at in the midst of the primaries. And Elizabeth Warren put forward a platform that was a direct result of her listening. She listened to Black women, to Black men, to the community. And we determined as Black women, independently and also as a coalition, she heard us. We're down for this. So I really do believe that had this been an election that was maybe after the 8 years of Obama, if this had been 2016 per se, that Elizabeth Warren really might have won. She might have won that primary. But because it wasn't, it was after 4 years of Trump and compounded terror. The one thing we knew we had to do was we had to stop it. And I think that the brilliance, the wisdom of Black Southerners was that they know white folk. They knew that this was not a time. White people were not ready to do a wholesale change of the system. And so what is it going to take to heal? So they went with Biden, and you know what? I followed suit, and I actually believe that since he appointed Kamala Harris as his vice president, there is a way that he is saying to all of us, I am not going to be the status quo. I am not going to try to return us to the days when you had to continue to fight and fight and fight and fight. We're going to make progress. Now, one thing I do not believe is that this is Jubilee. But what I do believe is that we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to move toward Jubilee with the Biden administration. And that movement would bring healing. It would incorporate public history projects like national monuments to acknowledge what happened, both the atrocities of the past and also the present and the triumphs. It would incorporate some kind of reparations, and it would also incorporate legislative action to enshrine the protection of our voting rights and our civil rights into law. And I believe it would also incorporate the expansion of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court has been literally wrecked over the last 4 years with I believe unjust appointments that completely tip the court and leave people of African descent and other people of color and vulnerable for the next 2 generations. Mm-hmm. So these are the things that would bring healing for us.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that historical perspective too, bringing it back to Jamar's point earlier in the conversation. Simone, I want to switch over to you for a second. You've gotten to know Joe Biden personally a bit over the years, and he was a big supporter of Nuns on the Bus tours. And that's a unique, not everyone has that personal connection with, someone who's going to be the most powerful person in the world. And I'm wondering, how do you think about that relationship and cultivating that? And what does that mean for sort of some policy priorities that you and Network will be able to push because of that access that was clearly, I'm imagining, you can tell me if I'm wrong if you had access to the Trump administration, but I imagine your access to the White House is going to be a little better now, a little warmer. Can you reflect on that a little bit and how you think about that relationship from both a personal standpoint, but also a policy standpoint?
Well, John, I have to say, it surprises me that I do know President-elect Biden, and that we've had several conversations. There's many conversations, mm-hmm. and that is like a surprise. But I think it goes back to what Lisa Sharon was saying, is how he is anything but transactional. He wants to know the story. He grabs you in. I mean, we got in trouble a little bit for that. He hugs people, he grabs people, and it's surprising if you don't know him. And the very first time I met him was at the signing of the Affordable Care Act celebration. And I met him on the rope line and introduced myself, and he grabs me and puts his forehead against my forehead. We proceeded to have the most authentic pastoral conversation about what it meant to care for those who were left out of healthcare, and the anguish and his worry, and how hard it was for him that our Catholic bishops opposed the ACA for lies. But it was this moment of tender meeting where he let his heart be shown. And I think that aspect, if he can stay with that, that will lead him to the deeper listening that Lisa Sharon and Jamar, Maggie, Melissa are talking about, because what happens in that process is then you've got room for more people in your heart. And good governance comes not from the head, it comes from the heart first, because it's about inclusion, about bringing people in, even people you disagree with. And I remember having this conversation. He convened some of those faith folks to talk about what we could do for gun violence after Newtown and how we were going to engage. And he tried to get people who ordinarily were not in favor of that at the table so we could have the conversation. And so I hold on to that as being important, But what we're going to have to do is COVID. I mean, we have 8 million people that are fallen into poverty. And now we're having a fight on Capitol Hill about a measly $600 for each person. I mean, it's wrong. We're going to have to deal with healthcare again because of the money that's been driven up in the healthcare system without any increase in value or cost. And it's more profit to the healthcare system. We're going to have to deal with the real need to invest in our infrastructure and in our nation. And then we're going to have to engage in what Pope Francis calls the politics of encounter, where we as people risk talking to each other. Because this isn't just about leadership. This is about us being able to talk across divisions. Outside of that, I'm sure we've got it covered. But I think it's Joe Biden's heart. It's Joe Biden's heart that is the strongest asset and can really move us forward in an entirely different way.
Thank you, Simone. To your point about bringing diverse people to the table, we certainly didn't see that under the Trump administration. It was mainly a white evangelical chorus behind him. And I wanted to ask Melissa, because I think it's a good segue. You and E.J. Young recently co-authored a report from the Brookings Institution that focused on how the executive branch should approach these issues related to religion and civil society. And, you really acknowledge, you and E.J. Was acknowledging that report, even among believers of the same faith, whether, Catholic, evangelical, Protestant, there's tension, right? And you said one side fears that marriage equality in Roe will be reversed and that Americans will be denied basic health care, commercial goods and services, and government-funded benefits based on an individual's gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity. The other side fears their government will brand them as bigots for their religious opposition to marriage equality, close their colleges and universities, press them to engage in activities that violate their consciences, and strip their institutions of tax-exempt status because of their beliefs. So, I mean, Melissa, in a very firsthand practical way, what it's like trying to balance competing goods, competing understanding of religious liberty, how hard it is to create a policy agenda in that sort of culture war framework that exists around these issues. I wonder, how you would think about advising the Biden team on some of these most difficult issues of religious freedom and holding together competing goods in a way that can move us forward productively and hopefully transcend some of these culture war fights, if that's how we approach it.
Right. Yeah. So I think there are obviously some very real and important differences in this area, and I don't mean to diminish that at all. At the same time, there's also a lot of confusion in this area. A lot of times people are arguing with each other when they don't even need to be arguing with each other because they're just talking past one another. So I think, first of all, picking up on what Simone was saying, bringing together people for conversation, people of goodwill for conversation that have differences over these issues, because I firmly expect, and I saw this happen when I worked at the White House, you can clear out a lot of underbrush right away because people aren't actually disagreeing about A, B, and C. They're disagreeing about D and E. So that's in itself a great common good when we can clear away misunderstandings in this area. And also when you can establish relationships and trust and respect, because even when an administration takes a position that, is not the position that some in the community had hoped that it would take, there are ways to honor relationships even in that circumstance. You can call people and let them know, we appreciated hearing your views. We disagreed with you for these reasons, but we would like to ask for your support in making this policy the best it can be. And we think we're going to be able to find agreements on these other issues and look forward to working with you there. That is, that helps so much. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, two other things I'll mention is quickly, we have two religion clauses in our First Amendment. We have an establishment clause, and we have that says the government can't establish religion, and we have a free exercise clause, can't prohibit it for exercise. So we need to keep that in mind. There are two clauses, not just one. And sometimes we'll tend, depending on what side of the aisle we're on to forget about one of them. And that's not right. That's not what the Constitution says. We also tend sometimes to only focus on one group of stakeholders and ignore the other stakeholders. We have in church state questions the interest of employers. We also have the interest of employees. We have the interest of faith-based organizations that are receiving federal funds to serve people in need. We also have the interest of people who are beneficiaries of those funds. If we're going to cover up one side of the equation, we're not doing good governance. We have to think about everybody. And then finally, I would just say that these issues I found, I knew this before I got into government, but I saw it even more clearly once I got there. These issues regularly arise across the federal executive branch, across almost all the federal agencies, and they arise all the time, sometimes in unexpected ways. So you really need to have a system in place that processes these issues carefully, consistently, with respect for all involved parties. And if you do that, you're not going to make everybody happy every time. That's clear. But you're going to show respect and rebuild some of this kind of civic and common good that we have had at our best in our nation's history, and I think can do even better about realizing in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Melissa. Jamar, I wanted to turn over to you. So you wrote in the New York Times back in August, you were reviewing Robert Jones's book, White Too Long, which is a book I really admire. And you wrote that events of the past decade, and especially recent months, have pushed conversations about race to the forefront of the national consciousness. It is a cultural moment that is forcing white Christians to declare their allegiances, whether to a religion that reinforces white supremacy or to one that dismantles it. As we think about Joe Biden as a white Christian, a second Catholic president in U.S. history, two thoughts came to my mind, and I'd love to hear you sort of help us think through this. One, Biden, as you know, was widely criticized, including from his now Vice President Kamala Harris, for his earlier views on busing, for his role in the crime bill in 1994 that drove up mass incarceration, and for the seemingly pretty warm relationships that he had with segregationist senators, including Senator James Eastland of Mississippi, where you live. At the same time, as you know, as we've talked about, Joe Biden is president in no small part because of the support that he garnered from the Black community. When his campaign was really on life support in the primary, it was South Carolina and Black Christians and Black churches that really resuscitated his campaign. And so I guess my question is, and I know it's a difficult one and a big question we could talk about for the next half an hour, given all these complexities and tensions with the Black community in terms of his past and some of the policies he's put forward, how do you assess kind of the opportunities and challenges that he will face in terms of addressing issues of race and structural inequality and racism? I think you're on mute, Jamar.
One of these days, we'll all figure that out. I appreciate the framing of that question because it gives us the opportunity to talk about challenges and opportunities from multiple vectors. And I want to start with the Black electorate. And so often, almost without exception at the federal level, our choices have been between openly racist and less racist. There's never an ideal candidate when it comes to their history of racial justice. And we see that with Biden. I mean, James Eastland was notorious, and he wasn't even the worst one when you were just talking about the state of Mississippi. And so we've always faced a difficult choice as Black voters and voters of color because no one has, at least at the federal and presidential level, really consistently advocated for us throughout their political careers. And so we're having to make those calculations. But that being said, I think the main opportunity Biden has with the Black community is very simple. Do not actively court racists and white supremacists for their vote. Like that's significant because typically in a two-party system, there is a party that is leaning on that base of voters and is going to send all the dog whistles, and as we've seen these past 4 years, the megaphones to signal to that base that they want their votes and they're on their side. So Biden has the opportunity to break with that and not openly court racists and white supremacists and play on racial fears. But that's a very low bar. Don't openly appeal to racists for votes. That's a very low bar. I think the challenge for Biden is to overcome the inertia of his own history and of his social location as a white man. So, of course, he's going to have to verbalize his break with some of the practices and relationships that he's had in the past, but he's also going to have to demonstrate it. And I think the real temptation for Biden is that it's going to be easy for him, in the name of bipartisanship, to overlook the racism, the xenophobia, the nationalism that so many Republicans have openly displayed. And he's going to want to, in the name of passing some legislation, sort of minimize those things. I think that's going to be a very high priority for him not to do if he wants to gain the trust of Black voters and other people of color, not to minimize those issues. I think there are some encouraging signs. I mean, he chose Kamala Harris as his vice president and running mate, and this is the woman who very famously criticized his stance on busing in a debate. And so that shows, perhaps he can grow, he can repent and move in a new direction. But he will, I think, have to work very hard to gain trust and answer for, essentially playing footsie with racists in the past. And concretely, that means not simply appointing Black people and people of color, but actually listening to their perspectives, acting on their judgment. And he has to trust the people who he's putting in place to do what's best for racial and ethnic minority communities.
Thank you, Jamar. I appreciate that. Lisa, I wanted to come over to you and somewhat of a dovetail a little bit with some of the points Jamar was making, but you were featured in a New Yorker article back in 2018 that I found really interesting about evangelicals of color. And as we talked about earlier, so much of the narrative around evangelicalism is white evangelicals. And so this piece was looking at the evangelical community from a very diverse perspective. And you said in that article that the whole Bible and evangelical faith, along with Protestant faith and Catholic faith, has been interpreted through the lens of empire. All of it has been interpreted through the lens of Caesar, and Caesar killed Jesus, and Jesus was an indigenous, brown, colonized man. So I guess when I read that, I was thinking a little bit about what you do. I mean, as a Christian activist who really works from the ground up and sometimes from outside the system, challenging these powerful institutions that are often led by white men and have kind of a imperial quality to them, whether it's the police or churches or government. How do you think about sort of striking this balance between challenging the Biden-Harris administration while also looking for opportunities to engage and sit down? And so I think what I'm getting at with this question is sort of the tension between prophetic resistance and the sort of practical nature of sitting down with the White House at a meeting and working on an agenda. How do you sit with that? If it is a creative tension, how do you sit with that? And what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you asked that. I think that the first thing we have to understand is that the era that we're in, that in the last 4 years, the primary word that was used in the context of the movement was resistance. That was the first word, and actually probably carried us through most of the 4 years. Resist, resist, resist. We are no longer in a period where resistance needs to be, at least we don't believe, needs to be the primary word. We are now in a time, I believe, of dreaming. We actually have to learn again to dream. We have to reimagine. We're in the exact perfect place to begin to reimagine how America can work, to reimagine the new America, the next America, and honestly, also the next church, because the church has also shown us by the fact that the majority, the white church in particular, the majority of white Christians have voted for white nationalists in both elections for various reasons, but yet on the very bottom line is that it wasn't a deal breaker. So we know that the faith of the majority of white Christians is not necessarily in alignment with the priorities of brown Jesus. So there's got to be a reimagining on both fronts. And in some sense, the question about partnership with the Biden administration and how we engage really rests with the administration. If the administration plays the middle ground and tries to appease, just like Jamar just said, if they try to appease the white people, either in the middle or especially toward the right, who don't want things to change too much, whose first response is, but what about white people? Then the prophetic push must happen. It's not going to be a push of resistance. It's going to be a push to begin to build, a push to do the right thing. Because I believe that because of Biden's faith, he has capacity that Trump didn't have, because Trump is a man without actual faith. He has capacity to be pushed to do good, to do justice when necessary. And I also believe, just like Simone said, that because of his faith, because of his superpower of empathy, he's already there in most cases. So it won't take much. It's just that we have to do the hard work of building the push from the outside. If the administration decides to center BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, with the understanding that to do that is to benefit all, when we center the needs of those who have been typically marginalized and pushed to the margins, then we actually will transform our nation in a way that blesses all. Well, hey, then I'm happy to work with the administration to move that agenda forward. And I mean that. I mean that not only myself, but I think that there needs to be a clear partnership in that case between movement leaders, those with our ears to the ground, those who have been helping to move the voices from the ground into the public square. Mm-hmm. That partnership with those who are the policymakers is essential.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate your point about moving, and this could be a debated point, we could talk about it, but moving from more of a resistance paradigm to a reimagining and dreaming paradigm. That's going to be a process, and maybe you can hold two of those together a little bit. So I really appreciate that, Lisa. Simone, I wanted to, and I recognize we're switching. Some of these questions are very tailored for particular people, so I recognize we're jumping a little bit, so I appreciate that. Simone, I wanted to talk a little bit about the pushback that Biden has gotten from Catholic bishops and other Catholic leaders from the very start of his campaign, as you know, really focusing in on his, opposition to criminalizing abortion. And as you know, the U.S. Bishops' Conference met not too long ago. I think it was back in November last month. And they actually appointed a special working group to examine what Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles called Biden's positions that, quote, undermine our preeminent priority of eliminating abortion. Now, at the same time, as you know, there will be lots of common ground between the Biden White House and the church. Pope Francis has welcomed the Biden administration in warmer tones. The first Black Catholic cardinal in the United States here in D.C., Cardinal Gregory, has sent signals that this will be a different kind of relationship. But I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I mean, what do you expect the Biden administration's relationship to be like with church leaders, and what advice might you give him to sort of help navigate both the opportunities and tensions that are going to, continue to exist, particularly with the hierarchy over the next 4 years?
Well, I think, John, that issue raises more about the tension in the Catholic Church than it does about the tension within our own national perspective. And what you saw at the Bishops' Conference was that tension between the Benedict XVI bishops and the Pope Francis bishops. I mean, that's it. So all President-elect Biden has to do is read the Exhortation on Holiness regularly, and he'll be fine. Because there, Pope Francis makes it abundantly clear that what our faith calls us to is not the criminalization of abortion. What our faith calls us to is the care for the pregnant woman. the care for the unborn. So let's leverage our care for the unborn and care for the moms. I mean, Lord knows, President-elect Biden has worked on this for a really long time. And that's what Pope Francis says. So he's got a good imprimatur for that. And then Pope Francis goes on to say, equally sacred to the care for the unborn, equally sacred is the care for the born, for the marginalized, for the migrant, for the refugee, for the asylum seeker, for those who, are in what he calls new forms of slavery and covert euthanasia. And I puzzled over covert euthanasia. And in this pandemic, I came to see what that is people dying because they can't access healthcare, is people having healthcare pulled away from them. And that's exactly what this current administration has been doing. And so part of me welcomes the fight with folks who have not read Pope Francis or have not embraced Pope Francis's teaching. And the very ones that used to criticize me for being a cafeteria Catholic because I didn't embrace all of their little fine points. Well, now who's cafeteria? Talk to me about that. So it could be an interesting civil war in public on the Catholic front, but President-elect Biden, he'll do fine. He's in relationship with the important folks and he knows how to talk to people. He'll be okay.
Thank you, Simone. Melissa, I wanted to ask you, you led the White House Faith Office, an office that George W. Bush started. President Obama put his distinctive stamp on it, creating a very diverse advisory council and named leaders to that council who were, as you wrote in the Washington Post, quote, diverse in many ways, including in their politics, ideology, and theology. And so, obviously, as we talked about, the Trump administration took a very different approach, mainly surrounding itself with white evangelicals who affirmed everything that he did. I'm curious, given your experience in the White House, in that office, how do you think the Biden administration will approach reestablishing the faith-based office? Do you expect a similar approach to the Obama years, or do you see something distinctive and different? I know all that is in flux right now, but I would love to hear your thinking on that.
Thanks, John. Well, I think what we saw during the campaign was a very intensive, I should say, relationship with faith communities and other parts of civil society, and an openness, to talking about religion and its role in public life, thinking about how religious and other civil society groups work to help those in need. So, I think that's something that I found very encouraging during the campaign, and you're seeing it happen during the transition as well. Also, of course, Vice President Biden, when I was in the White House during the second term, was very active with our office and its work. And really, you didn't have to explain any of this to him. He got it immediately, and he was immediately focused on how we could do more together to help people who are struggling. So I think all those very encouraging signs. In the report that we wrote, what we recommended was that this office be reestablished and put in the Domestic Policy Council with strong ties to the National Security Council as well, but actually based in the Domestic Policy Council as it was during the Obama years. And that the mission be clarified, because I think sometimes, especially over the last 4 years, that hasn't always been very clear. So the mission of that office is serving people in need. And the means by which to accomplish the mission is working with faith and secular groups to help people in need. So it's not about a governmental office to promote religion or some version of religion that would, obviously at least be in tension with the First Amendment. But it is to serve people in need and to work with those middlemen who are the religious and civil society groups who both know government and work with government, and also know people who are struggling and can help connect them to governmental resources and help them to, apply for federal aid for college, for example, and make sure that they actually get that form submitted. And then when a student has that help, it can change their whole life. So that's so important. And we recommend that the office, so clarify that mission, clarify that we need to work with both secular and religious organizations. Both provide important value in these partnerships, and that financial and non-financial partnerships are very important. We also recommend that other agency offices be established by executive order, including ones in the Corporation for National and Community Service and the EPA, because those are two big focal points that we think need to be addressed, and that the new administration retain all the existing agency centers for faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. I thought a really interesting point that my colleague and Joshua Dubois made in our conversations, and he, of course, directed the faith-based and neighborhood partnerships office in the first Obama term, was to say that a focal point of the partnerships in the Biden-Harris administration should be on racial disparities. And we have seen this manifested, of course, most starkly recently with the pandemic, where communities of color have borne the disproportionate burden of illnesses and deaths. And so this is just crying out for attention. So I hope that that'll be an area of focus. And then also, we think that for renewal of these partnerships is absolutely key for the new administration to reach out to religious and ethnic and racial minorities, to reach out to LGBTQ communities, to reach out to explicitly secular communities that have been, in many cases, sort of ignored or insulted during the last 4 years, treated as they are as if they are second-class citizens, which is just shameful in the extreme. So this needs to be a first area of these areas need to be first areas of outreach, I think, for the incoming administration, as well as reaching across ideological and political divides, because this office at its best can be this profound engine of depolarization. When we can come together around serving people in need, even if we disagree about lots of other things, we can begin to see each other as humans, fellow Americans, valuable friends and neighbors, and that can change the whole, tenor of our conversations and the whole fabric of our country. So I hope those will be some of the steps that will be taken.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Jamar, I wanted to ask you this question, and as I was going over my questions for this panel, I realized this might be the hardest question of the afternoon. So, lucky you get the lottery on this one. And I say that because I think it, in some sense, asked you to sort of become a political pundit a bit, and we'll see how it goes. But it's an interesting question to me, and others on the panel, if they want to take a crack at it and help Jamar out too, because again, this is a challenging one. But as everyone knows, there was some attention coming out of the election that while Biden did win overwhelmingly with Black voters and communities of color, he actually did improve his numbers with some voters of color in this election, including Black men. One analysis found that 1 in 3 Black men living in the Midwest voted for him, for example, which was kind of stunning to me. How do you make sense of that? And, there's often the criticism that the Democratic Party takes communities of color and African Americans in particular for granted. Was that part of it? Do you see other factors going on? Maybe from your historical perspective, you can help us understand that. But it's just something that there's been a lot of commentary around that issue. And I just wonder if you have some thoughts on that, and particularly, again, from your expertise as an historian, if there's any wisdom that you can share with us.
Well, thank you so much.
Never come back to any
It's an important one, though. It's an important one because I think the reason it is of interest is that it seems to defy logic on certain levels. I will say that probably Black women are best positioned to answer this question. Sort of like Black people in general kind of know white people better than they know themselves. I think Black women know Black men sometimes better than we know ourselves. And so I'd be very interested in other perspectives on this. That being said, I can offer some tentative sort of explanations. I think there's multiple layers to this. Number one, we tend to forget this, but Black people are not ideologically monolithic. And when it comes to politics, there are conservative Black people, politically conservative Black people. And so there are some, particularly on the economic front, who think Trump has done a good job and were voting for him because they thought he was strong on economics. Now, I have a very different perspective of the way his economics has worked or hasn't worked for certain people, but they're looking at his track record on these issues, and they like it and they wanted to see more of it. More broadly, they support other politically conservative policy positions and wanted to support Republicans on that front. But I think there are deeper levels to this. I think there's a level of chauvinism and patriarchy that's going along with this, that Black men see Trump's bravado, his brashness, his vulgarity, and they think that's what it means to be a man. And they think that is, contravening what they know of politics and politicians, and they like it. There's some sense in which they might even aspire to have that level of not caring about anyone or anything. I think there are some Black folks, Black men, who have garnered a level of attention and platform by being contrarian and by showing, well, hey, we can be quote unquote free thinkers, and I don't toe the racial lines. Look at me, and they've actually gotten speaking opportunities and writing opportunities, and even just more informally sort of a cultural sense of being important. And I think sort of at the sort of psychological level, it's almost a misguided attempt at survival. All Black people and people of color, we got to find a way to escape the indignities that are thrust upon us by white supremacy and racism. We got to find ways to recover our sense of dignity. Most of us do so by choosing to reject this narrative of inferiority and not going along with those who are promoting these ideas. But some Black men, I think, misguidedly think they can escape the stigma of being Black that white supremacy promotes by becoming virtually white in every way possible. And I don't know that this is always a conscious decision, but they see agreeing with and adopting ideologies, even anti-Black ideologies, as a way of ingratiating themselves to white people, finding acceptance and dodging the kind of indignities that are thrust upon us. I know it doesn't work, but I think some combination of all of these things might be at play.
Well, I appreciate a very eloquent answer to a very tough question, so thank you. And I didn't know, Lisa, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on that. If you did, please.
I do. Thank you for asking. So first of all, yes for everything that Jamar just said. I can't say it better. I will only add this one piece. I actually think that another contributing factor is that the Democratic Party has not spoken enough about the creation of wealth, the creation of flourishing, and has focused almost exclusively on helping people to get out of poverty, which is also absolutely necessary, 100% necessary. But if you don't balance that, then our community, people of African descent, we end up being lifted out of poverty only to become consumers and not actually leaders, not actually having the resources to go to college, to go to grad school, to become leaders in the community. And wealth creation enables flourishing in our capitalist society. Now, there's all kinds of debates about what kind of economy we should have. Should it be blah, 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 blah. That's not what this, we have one now. And this is the one we have to operate within for now, for the time that we're in. And so the question of how do we flourish in this economy is one that Black men, I think especially, who are most often charged with being when in the home, when allowed to be in the home, because they're not put in prison or separated from their families by other policies that have been put in place. When they're in the home, they are the breadwinners. They are thinking, I need to be a breadwinner. I need to be a man. And so wealth creation is attractive. And the I think the false promise that Trump offered to Black men was, I can make you like me.
Right.
But when you look at who he really is, he's actually in deep debt. He doesn't have anything. He's actually not wealthy at all. And he's a horrible businessman. So I just think that if the Democratic Party were to strengthen its message around flourishing, and message and policies that give people the capacity to flourish, then we would attract more people of African descent to the party, more Black men in particular.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. So we're kind of at almost the time. I wanted to have one last question that everyone could offer a few thoughts on, because I want to be respectful of people's time. So, and we can start with really anyone who wants to jump on this, but if you had an hour, well, let's say an hour and a half, to sit down with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the next month, what would you stress in that meeting? And what would you be looking to hear in that meeting? Whoever wants to start, we don't have to have a particular order, but where I can call on somebody.
Well, I'll start because I want to second what Lisa, Sharon, and Jamar were saying about, and I think faith has a tremendous role to play in a theology of abundance where all are called to flourish. And that's the policy that we need to develop and to unhook it from the myth. And I think the connection with some African-American, well, some guys and some others, women, the connection is looking at the stock market as the measure of how we're doing, not looking at how are our families doing, and shifting that measure of success from stock market, which was the Trumpian measure, to our people's capacity to flourish in community. Then I think we could make real progress in a partnership that is that inclusive piece that Melissa was talking about, because we all hunger for that, and that we could really heal and restore our sense of community and families. And I think the Biden-Harris duo would be all in on that.
No, thank you, Simone. That was a good addition to that. Maybe Melissa, do you want to? I mean, you've been in the room.
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank the presidential scheduler for giving me an hour and a half with Biden Harris. I think that's awesome. Thank you, John. Yeah, I mean, first, I know I would all want to say thank you to them for taking on these awesome responsibilities and for what they've done already to help to bring a sense of hope and to bring the country a little closer together, and to do so in such a responsible way. So that would be first. And I would want to also say that, government's relationship to the religious sector and civil society more broadly is just going to be so important in their work to bring the nation more closely together. And, they have these wonderful plans for government to act boldly in across a range of areas, and I applaud that. I think it's also very important to remember that government needs civil society to be a partner in that work. And when civil society is asked to help with that work, we will get much more than the sum of its parts. And then finally, I would say that on these church-state religious liberty issues, they will come up in issues that are top ticket items like the pandemic, like education, and many other things, and maybe even issues like climate change and other things. So can we make sure that from the very beginning, there is a plan and a structure in place for processing those issues so that there is a coherent and a consistent approach on those issues across the board? I think that'll be not only smart, but it'll also do a lot to help us have a better functional as opposed to a dysfunctional approach to church-state issues in the United States of America. And then I'd ask them to hand over the 2-page executive summary of our report and, and ask if they would take 2 minutes to read that.
There you go. Thank you, Melissa. Jamar, how about you?
So I would want to talk to them about Christian nationalism and white supremacist extremism. The Department of Homeland Security did their annual threat assessment, and they named white supremacist extremism as the greatest domestic terror threat in our nation. Mm-hmm. And we have seen elements of this with groups marauding in Washington, D.C., just recently tearing down Black Lives Matter signs from historic Black churches. And I think it's so important, even in the context of this conversation, because religion is always a part of this white supremacist extremism, particularly Christianity. There's this toxic blend of racism and nationalism and religion that has infected and infested so many parts of Christianity in the United States. And I would want to talk to them about their plans to directly address that. We're seeing this manifest itself in the political realm. We're seeing this manifest itself in the church, on news networks. It's so pervasive. It's so widespread that it has to be a priority, especially because taken to its logical and nefarious ends, it results in violence. All sorts of violence, particularly physical violence, but also mental, emotional, and spiritual violence as well. So I want to talk to them in depth about that, probably give them some history along with that to trace the breadcrumbs to how we got here and see how we might move forward.
Thank you, Jamar. Simone, you want to take a shot at that one? Simone looks like she might be other.
Oh, I got first dibs, so I started. So
I think it's me.
Bad moderator. Go ahead, Lisa.
That's okay, no problem. Thanks so much, Simone. I appreciate that. So I think that if I were to get an hour with President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, I would want to talk about how do we move the nation? How do we move the church, in particular, people, not just the church, but people of faith across the nation, closer to the desire for the kind of transformation that can bring flourishing to all? Mm-hmm. In other words, to repair what race broke in the world, because race is the fundamental and most consequential organizing construct within our national legal canon, within our national structure, legal structure. It was first established all the way back in 1622 and 1662 And 1662 to 2020 is a long time to have a racial structure shaping public life for all. So how can we repair what race broke in the world is what I'd want to talk with them about. And how do we move the nation to want to make that repair?
Thank you, Lisa. Sister Simone?
All right, you're going to let me have this because I just want to sum up what I think is critical is what we're each talking about in different ways is bringing into the room, at least metaphorically, in our words, a diverse set of people that can engage in governance of we the people. And in this context, I want to point out there's a difference between what the administration can do and then how they work with Congress. Because in Congress, you got to work with some of those white supremacist folks if you're going to get anything done. And it's painful, it's horrible, and I sometimes feel like I have to go take a shower after doing it. But I care so much to get some legislation done. Let's do it. And then on the administrative side, we can do the broader work of shifting. And I think that is doable.
All right.
And can I just add, John, that I really want to thank you for organizing this panel. And I want to thank the panelists because I think that there's just so much good work that we can do together among ourselves and really thinking about what we envision for the next, the near future of our time together in this country. People of shared faiths and different faiths and no faith at all. But I think without your organizing, bringing us together, we might miss these opportunities. So I just really want to thank you, John, for doing that. And I just so look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you, because I have so much respect for you and so much appreciation for the opportunity to work with you as fellow Americans.
Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that. And the feeling is mutual. And to go back to a point that Lisa made, I mean, moving from this, holding the resistance, the prophetic resistance, but moving to a place of reimagining and dreaming, that's a deeply religious and moral sensibility. And I think we can do that together over these next 4 years. So thank you all for your writing and your activism, your gift of hope. I know I'm inspired by all of you. I follow all of you on Twitter. I read all your books, and I really appreciate your time. You were definitely the all-star panel that I was going for, so thank you. And I want to thank all of you for watching today, and I hope everyone has a healthy and happy holiday break and comes back stronger and restored for this new year and the new opportunities that we have moving forward in the next 4 years. So thank all of you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.